Let's get a view in from Moody's. They put out a note today, in fact, saying that India is one of the least vulnerable countries. Joining us on the phone line is Christian de Guzman, Vice President at the Sovereign Risk Group at Moody's. Christian, thanks so much for taking our call. Apologies to keep you waiting. Your note says that India is actually in this time in the club of the least vulnerable rather than the most vulnerable should this currency pressure persist.
Yes, that's right. I think it's important to note that our sovereign ratings, which we are commenting on, really have to do with the government repaying its debt. So I think what we're trying to say here is that the currency depreciation in the current context is really not much of a factor when we look at the government's ability to pay back its debt. It is indeed, amongst emerging markets, probably one of the most dependent on domestic local currency sources of financing. And so the converse of that really is that the government, at least, and we're not saying the economy at the whole, but the government at least is less dependent or less vulnerable to these currency swings.
Christian, just to understand this, when you look at the external indicators, so if you're looking at reserve cover, etc., are you measuring it mostly on imports? Are you looking at it as a percentage of short-term debt? Are you also adding NRI deposits into it to judge, the external vulnerability at your end?
Sure. Okay. I guess there's two things that I think that we're talking about here. I guess what I was mentioning just now was the proportion of the government's debt that's denominated in currencies other than rupee. And then, of course, there's another aspect of external stability, which is reserve coverage. And here we are looking at what we call the external vulnerability indicator. So we're not like the IMF. We're not looking at months of imports. We are a debt rating agency where we're concerned about the government's ability to pay back its debt. So we're looking at the amount of short-term debt, NRI deposits, because we're looking at non-resident deposits, as well as any long-term debt that's coming due over the next year, and take that sum as a proportion of foreign currency reserves, which we think still is quite ample in the case of India.
All right. Christian, a broader view, when you look across Asia, which are the economies which are, most vulnerable or least vulnerable, or are the more vulnerable economies actually this time around outside of Asia? Argentina, Turkey have been mentioned in your note.
Yes, indeed. Well, in the case of Asia Pacific, I mean, there are a couple of names that still stand out in terms of this vulnerability to a stronger U.S. dollar and the sort of associated capital flows. At the very top, we do worry about Mongolia, which is, rated well below that of India. Elsewhere in the region, we're looking at Sri Lanka and the Maldives. So these are sort of the top three that we're looking at in the region. But there continues to be, some pressure points outside of the region that are much more prominent. We're looking at places like Turkey, Zambia, Ghana, Argentina. Of course, Turkey and Argentina with garnered the most interest because they do have a lot of tradable debt.